The shore lies quiet in the last tint of dusk, the kind of soft violet haze that settles over the water like a memory refusing to fade. Waves whisper against the sand as though they're trying to tell a story, but the wind steals the words before they form. You can almost hear footsteps that should be there, but aren't, voices that should echo across the island, but fell silent more than 4 centuries ago. Roanoke feels empty in a way that isn't natural. It feels emptied, as if something deliberately swept all traces of life from this place. People disappear all the time. Villages are abandoned. Settlements fail. But what happened here wasn't simple failure, and it wasn't natural abandonment. It was erasure. Imagine standing at the edge of the old settlement site, looking out toward the pale line where sky meets sea, knowing that somewhere between those two horizons, 115 men, women, and children simply cease to exist. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no graves, no bones, not even everyday objects left scattered in panic. Just an eerily organized silence. And in the center of that silence, a single carved word, an incomplete message, or a clue left by people who knew they were vanishing from the world's history. Most recountings of Roanoke tell the story plainly. The settlers came, built their little wooden houses, struggled, waited, and vanished. But that's merely the surface-level tale, an outline as fragile as the faded maps that charted England's first steps in a new world. Beneath the familiar version of events lies something deeper, something stranger. A feeling that the colony wasn't lost by accident, nor consumed by some mundane misfortune. The closer one looks, the more the story begins to feel like a curtain hiding another stage, where players older and more secretive than the English crown had their own reasons for choosing this exact island, this exact coastline, at this exact moment in time. History tends to smooth over its rough edges, sanding down mysteries into comfortable explanations. It tells us that the settlers probably starved or fled inland, or were absorbed by local tribes. These are easy, digestible answers, the kind that let us close the book and move on. But if you've ever walked alone through Roanoke's forests, you might sense something else lingering between the pines. The island doesn't feel like a place where people died in desperation. It feels like a place where people disappeared with intention. To understand that feeling, you have to imagine the colonists themselves, not as dusty figures in textbooks, but as living people stepping onto a foreign shore, guided by dreams and fears they themselves barely understood. Some hope for land, some for wealth, some for a new start. Yet what if there were others among them with motives not written in any charter? Motives hidden in coded correspondence, whispered alliances, or the shadows of old European troubles that still hunted them across the ocean. Roanoke was not chosen randomly. Even in the 1580s, long before modern technology or satellites, people knew the difference between a promising location and a doomed one. So why choose a site that offered little natural protection, poor farmlands, and vulnerable access points? Why insist on returning to it again and again, even after earlier expeditions warned that the island held secrets and dangers? Unless the colony's true purpose was something other than survival, something more aligned with hidden agendas or ancient maps known only to a select few. When John White returned to England for supplies and became trapped there by war, he expected to come back to a thriving settlement. Instead, 3 years later, he found emptiness. The houses were dismantled, not burned. Belongings carefully removed, not left behind. There was no sign of haste or fear. It looked less like an evacuation and more like a relocation, a migration, or perhaps the completion of a plan that outsiders were never meant to witness. But what plan could require 115 people, families, artisans, skilled workers, to vanish into the vast wilderness? A plan so important that decades of searching, decades of silence, and centuries of historical interpretation still fail to reveal its shape. The forests around Roanoke hold clues, but none are complete. Stories passed down through indigenous nations speak of pale outsiders who came not in the 1500s, but far earlier. They describe symbols burned into wood and stone that resemble European iconography from centuries before the English crown looked westward. Could Roanoke have been chosen because someone, long before Queen Elizabeth's advisors, already knew the island's hidden significance? And if so, what ancient knowledge or relics might have drawn him here? The winds that blow over the island seem to carry more than salt and memory. They carry an atmosphere of enigma, of something left unfinished. Even today, archaeologists uncover fragments that don't quite match any official narrative. European copper predating English arrival, stones etched with unfamiliar marks, old maps showing the coastline with impossible accuracy. Everything feels like part of a larger puzzle whose image has been deliberately blurred. As dusk settles and the last light fades beyond the trees, the island seems to withdraw into itself. Shadows stretch long and still, as if waiting. The air grows heavy with an unspoken question that has lived on this land for over 4 centuries. What really happened to the Roanoke colonists? The answer, if it ever existed in plain sight, has been swallowed by layers of omission, secrecy, and selective storytelling. But tonight, we peel back those layers. Slowly, carefully, like lifting the corner of an old map to reveal what lies beneath. This journey begins not with conclusions, but with curiosity, with the sense that the familiar story of Roanoke is only the beginning of something far older, far stranger, and far more intertwined with forces history prefers not to name. The island whispers its secrets softly, but if you listen long enough, a pattern begins to emerge. And that pattern leads to places most historians refuse to walk. Most people first learn about Roanoke through a simple, tidy version of events. A bold English expedition, a small wooden fort, a hopeful community trying to survive in an unfamiliar world. And then, nothing. A clean disappearance. A mystery wrapped in a single carved word. Textbooks summarize it in a paragraph or two, offering explanations that feel practical and safe. According to the official narrative, the settlers likely moved inland to live with friendly tribes, or they succumbed to famine, or they were killed during conflicts. These explanations soothe the mind. They allow history to remain orderly, predictable, and obedient to logic. But history rarely behaves that way, and Roanoke least of all. When you examine the original accounts closely, the cracks begin to appear. Not small ones, but fractures deep enough that the entire official story starts to feel strangely incomplete. Take the departure of John White, for example. When he left the colony to obtain supplies, he did so reluctantly, urged by the settlers themselves. They were struggling, but they weren't desperate. They had relationships with nearby indigenous groups. They had begun planting crops, and they were adapting to the land. There was no sense of panic in White's final entries. He described activity, not abandonment. Yet when he returned 3 years later due to war delays, the scenario he found made no sense within that framework. The wooden fort had been carefully dismantled, not destroyed. The houses were taken apart with intention. Doors were removed and repurposed. A chest he buried for safekeeping was dug up, not in haste, but methodically. Even the palisade walls had been removed plank by plank. People in crisis don't dismantle their homes before fleeing. They leave everything behind. What White discovered suggested order, planning, and a group that knew exactly what it was doing. Then there's the carving, the word Croton. The official story claims it was simply the colonists' way of telling White their new location. But even that falls apart under scrutiny. Why carve it onto 2 different locations? Why use a term that held layered meanings, some of them ceremonial, some of them geographic, some of them cryptic even to neighboring tribes? White instructed the settlers to carve a cross if they were leaving under duress. No cross appeared, yet at the same time, he reported that the location seemed fortified, as if the colonists expected danger. How do you reconcile a peaceful relocation with defensive preparations? And why did White never conduct a full search of Croton Island, despite the clue being so direct? Why sail away almost immediately after spotting the word? These questions rarely appear in school lessons, yet they sit at the heart of the mystery. When examining official correspondence between English advisors, another layer of confusion emerges. Early letters reveal that Queen Elizabeth I and her inner circle were less concerned about the settlers' safety and more interested in something they believed the New World held, something hinted at in John Dee's coded writings and in secret maps that have since vanished. Raleigh, the architect of the colony, was under tremendous pressure to keep certain findings private. Some letters mention materials expected from Roanoke but not described. Others reference a matter of great antiquity that Raleigh's men supposedly encountered. These remarks never made it into public reports and were quietly buried in archives, accessible only to a handful of royal officials. Even the ship logs from the relief fleet contain puzzling contradictions. Some mention smoke rising from Roanoke long before White landed, as if someone was signaling. Yet when they arrived, there was no fire, no people, no evidence of recent activity. Other logs describe seeing European-style structures along nearby coasts, buildings that should not have existed. Mainstream history dismisses these entries as misinterpretations or exaggerations, but the consistency across multiple accounts makes that dismissal uncomfortable. Further complicating matters is the landscape of the island itself. Archaeological studies show that the English lived there for a shorter period than previously thought, and yet the amount of missing material doesn't line up. Everyday items vanish without trace. Iron tools, weapons, cookware, all gone. Objects like these should have survived in the soil. Even if people relocated, they would have left broken pieces, scraps, fragments. Instead, the area feels unnaturally clean, almost curated. The soil layers where artifacts should rest are strangely empty, as if someone intentionally removed all traces of an English presence long before historians ever arrived. Then there are the contradictory testimonies from later explorers. Some claimed that blue-eyed native children were living inland, speaking a broken form of English. Others reported fortified villages resembling European designs. One account even mentions a tribe that adopted a crest resembling the English lion, though this is often dismissed as coincidence. But coincidences begin to accumulate, stacking upon one another until they no longer resemble accidents at all. And despite repeated attempts by the English crown to collect all stories into a single, unified explanation, discrepancies persisted. The official narrative also neglects how unusual Roanoke's chosen location was. Strategically, it made little sense. It was difficult to resupply, surrounded by unstable, shifting sands, vulnerable to storms, and positioned in a way that made defense nearly impossible. Experienced explorers warned against settling there. Yet Raleigh insisted. Why? The convenient explanation is that they misjudged the coastline. But their maps were too detailed to support that claim. Something about the island mattered. Something documented in private letters but erased from public reports. Modern historians often blame starvation or conflict, but none of the surrounding tribes recorded mass violence against the settlers. Oral traditions mention scattered individuals, small groups, but not an entire community wiped out. And none described the English dying of hunger en masse. Several tribes even expressed confusion when asked about the missing colonists. They spoke of encounters, but not disappearance. Which means the official story requires us to accept that 115 people vanished without leaving a single reliable witness among numerous surrounding nations. That, statistically and historically, is nearly impossible. So the official narrative, simple, clean, and comfortable, begins to unravel the moment you tug at its edges. Every detail opens another question. Every explanation dissolves when examined closely. Roanoke was not a typical colony, and its disappearance was not a typical tragedy. The official version sounds plausible only when the darker, deeper, and older layers of the story are brushed aside. And so, after more than 4 centuries, we are left with a paradox. The more we trust the official story, the less sense Roanoke makes. But when we let go of the familiar version, when we allow ourselves to consider alternative motivations, hidden influences, and suppressed observations, a different picture begins to form. One threaded with mystery, secrecy, and a sense that Roanoke was never meant to be understood through the lens of ordinary history. The colony didn't just disappear. It slipped out of the narrative we were given, leaving behind a void that modern explanations cannot fill. And in the center of that void stands the most unsettling question of all. If the official history isn't the truth, then what is? Long before the English dreamed of planting a flag on the edge of the New World, shadows from older worlds had already stretched across the Atlantic. The story usually begins in 1587, with ships and settlers stepping onto unfamiliar soil. But the deeper you dig, the more you realize that Roanoke's mystery doesn't start there at all. It begins centuries earlier, with sailors, wanderers, and exiles who crossed the ocean long before the age of official exploration. Their footprints are faint, erased by time, and rewritten by conquerors. Yet traces of their presence linger in fragments of legend, in odd artifacts, and in landscapes marked by hands that weren't supposed to be there. Most people know the Viking stories, the sagas describing Vinland, explored by Norse adventurers around the year 1000. These accounts place Europeans along the North American coast nearly 600 years before Roanoke. Archaeological findings in Newfoundland confirm this. But the Norse were not the only ones who ventured westward. Welsh legends tell of Prince Madoc, who allegedly fled political turmoil in the 12th century and sailed west with a group of followers. Some indigenous oral traditions speak of pale-skinned settlers who lived among them long before the English, people who built unusual fortifications and left behind weapons unlike those of any tribe. These stories often appear in the margins of history, dismissed as myth. Yet they carry an unsettling consistency, as though echoing a truth too inconvenient for official timelines. Then there are the Portuguese accounts, stories of secret voyages to lands beyond the great waters, whispered among captains who guarded their charts more fiercely than their treasure. Some historians have argued that João Vaz Corte Real, the father of 2 famous explorers, reached the American coastline decades before Columbus. There are also Basque fishermen who traveled so far west in search of whale and cod that by the time official expeditions began, they were already familiar with the waters. These seafarers left no colonial records, no official claims, but their silent presence may have shaped coastal cultures long before England's ambitions took root. And yet, even these early visits do not explain the strange symbols found along parts of the eastern seaboard. Carvings that resemble European crosses, geometric marks etched with a style reminiscent of medieval masons, and structures that some claim align with Old World architectural methods. The deeper question emerges. If not the Vikings, not the Portuguese, and not the Welsh, then who left these enigmatic signs? And why? This trail of half-forgotten visitors eventually leads to a far more controversial idea, one that links Roanoke to a group not typically associated with the American wilderness, the persecuted remnants of the Knights Templar. In 1307, the order was violently dismantled by European monarchs, their leaders arrested, their possessions seized, and their archives burned. But according to legends whispered for centuries, a large portion of their fleet escaped capture. Those surviving ships vanished from European records. Some claimed they fled to Scotland. Others believed they sailed west, carrying with them not only their wealth, but their knowledge, relics, and sacred obligations. Before dismissing the theory entirely, Consider the evidence that suggests pre-Columbian contact between mysterious European groups and indigenous tribes. Coastal communities recorded encounters with men wearing long garments, bearing symbols of unknown origin, and speaking languages that resembled no tribe. Some of these encounters describe rituals unfamiliar to native cultures, ceremonial movements, particular uses of the cross, and a reverence towards sacred stones or towers. It's easy to attribute these accounts to misunderstandings, yet the imagery is strikingly similar to Templar practices. Maps add another layer of intrigue. Some medieval charts depict parts of the American coastline with surprising accuracy, even before Columbus. How could cartographers have drawn shorelines they supposedly hadn't seen? Historians often call these coincidences, but coincidences begin to pile up. The Zeno map, the Piri-Reis map, and certain fragments attributed to early Mediterranean navigators show shapes too precise to be imagination. More strangely, several of these maps were kept in private collections connected to secretive brotherhoods, individuals known to safeguard forbidden knowledge. If the Templars or similar esoteric groups had reached the Americas centuries before England, then the question arises, what were they searching for? Templar tradition is steeped in legends of sacred relics, lost knowledge, and ancient places of power. Their sudden interest in sailing west could hint at something more than simple escape. Perhaps they knew of a land across the ocean rumored to hold artifacts or wisdom tied to even older civilizations. Indigenous legends from the East Coast speak of keepers of the shining symbol, strangers who blended into the land, shared certain skills, and vanished again. Some stories describe them as guardians or watchers. Others say they built temporary sanctuaries and left behind markers that only specific people could understand. These accounts fit eerily well with the notion of a hidden group attempting to start anew in an unknown world. And here lies the connection to Roanoke. The island itself has signs of earlier human presence that doesn't fully match indigenous patterns. The land has evidence of small, isolated stone structures, unusual alignments, and clearing patterns not attributed to the English. Some researchers believe the island may have been visited and mapped long before Raleigh's expedition. The unsettling question becomes, did the English choose Roanoke because they believed it was suitable or because someone had already flagged it as meaningful centuries earlier? It's easy to dismiss all this as speculation, but consider how explorers often relied on old charts or inherited knowledge from sources they didn't disclose. Information passed through secret societies, private libraries, and coded writings. The Elizabethan court was full of men obsessed with mysticism, hidden voyages, and ancient wisdom. If they possessed scraps of knowledge hinting that the American coast held remnants of earlier visitors, it would explain their peculiar interest in Roanoke, a location that otherwise made little strategic sense. The more you explore these overlaps, the more the conventional timeline begins to fray. A picture emerges of a coastline known in fragments by different groups, visited in scattered moments across centuries. These travelers didn't leave colonies or official histories. They left whispers, symbols, and faint footprints that were later erased or ignored by modern historians. But their presence lingers like a shadow, just beyond the reach of accepted narratives. And so, Roanoke's story stretches beyond its colonial walls. It becomes part of a much older mystery, one where forgotten voyages, sacred missions, and hidden knowledge converge on a small island in the Outer Banks. The settlers who stepped onto Roanoke may not have been the first Europeans to stand there. They may have unknowingly walked into a place already marked by others, a place chosen long before their ships appeared on the horizon, a place woven into a network of secrets carried across oceans in the quiet centuries before history began keeping official score. For most people, the Knights Templar exist somewhere between fact and legend, suspended in an almost mythical fog. They are remembered as warrior monks, protectors of pilgrims, guardians of the Holy Land, and eventual martyrs of medieval politics. But behind the familiar images, the white mantles, the Red Cross, the vows of poverty, was an organization far more complex, secretive, and powerful than most history books admit. And when their order collapsed in 1307, they didn't simply vanish into dust. A disappearance of that magnitude leaves echoes, trails, and questions that still ripple through history. Roanoke, strangely enough, lies along one of those ripples. To understand how a medieval order could possibly connect to an American colony established nearly 300 years later, you have to revisit the final days of the Templars in Europe. Their fall was not spontaneous. It was orchestrated with precision by King Philip IV of France, a ruler drowning in debt to the order. Philip owed the Templars sums so enormous that repaying them was nearly impossible. And so, instead of paying, he planned their destruction. On a Friday morning, October 13th, 1307, soldiers stormed Templar commanderies across France, arresting members, seizing assets, and branding the order heretical. What followed was torture, forced confessions, and slow execution. But the most important part of this event isn't what Philip captured. It's what he didn't. The Templar fleet, the backbone of their global operations, their transport arm, their escape route, was gone before Philip's men could seize it. Documents from the time mention entire harbors suddenly emptied of Templar ships. Chroniclers whispered of departures under the cover of night, of crews sworn to silence, and of vessels carrying cargo that no one dared describe. Some spoke of the fleet splitting up, some ships heading toward Scotland, where the Templars found refuge among sympathetic clans, others sailing for more distant, uncharted shores. One chilling detail in several accounts is the conviction that the Templars had been preparing for this disaster long before it happened. They were not caught unaware. They were already in motion. Scotland was one destination. From there, some believe the surviving Templars merged with local groups, stonemasons, scholars, initiates, and eventually influenced the formation of the Freemasons. But Scotland was not large enough to hide an entire fleet indefinitely. And it certainly wasn't a place where the Templars could rebuild their power or safeguard the relics and documents they were rumored to possess. If they sought true safety, they needed distance. They needed a place beyond the reach of kings and popes. They needed a world that Europe didn't yet claim. And so the theory arises, did some Templar ships sail west across the Atlantic in search of sanctuary? It might sound far-fetched until you consider the centuries of maritime experience the order possessed. The Templars were not merely warriors. They were skilled sailors with extensive knowledge of oceans, currents, star navigation, and shipbuilding. They operated ports and fleets across the Mediterranean, North Atlantic, and even the western coasts of Europe. They worked with maps whose full contents remain unknown. Some of these charts, copied and recopied over the centuries, appear again in the hands of explorers who came long after. When Columbus's logs mention ancient maps that guided him, scholars speculate that fragments of older cartography, possibly from the Templars, had survived in secret archives. And if the Templars reached the American coastline, they would have sought places where they could hide their presence, build quickly, and remain unseen. Here is where the story pierces the edges of accepted history. Along the eastern seaboard, particularly in regions corresponding to modern-day Nova Scotia, New England, and the Carolinas, archaeologists and amateur explorers have discovered strange sites. Stone structures that resemble medieval European craftsmanship, crosses carved into rock in distinct Templar fashion, and underground chambers aligned with astronomical precision. These findings are controversial. Some scholars argue they are colonial or indigenous. Others suggest they are hoaxes. Yet too many of these symbols cluster around particular coastal areas, as if marking a route or network. Legends from indigenous nations tell of pale visitors who arrived centuries before Columbus. Men dressed in white or bearing crosses in unusual styles. Men who seemed burdened by a sacred purpose. Some tribes welcomed them, others feared them, but all described them as different from the Spanish, Portuguese, or Norse. These stories linger like smoke trails of a forgotten meeting between two worlds. And whether the men in these tales were Templars or another unknown group, they reinforce the idea that Europe's fingerprints reached the continent long before official timelines allow. If the Templars found refuge in a new world, they would have needed a series of safe locations. Ports where they could repair ships, hide relics, and possibly build small communities. The Outer Banks, with its concealed waterways and shifting sands, would have been a perfect choice. Hard to reach, harder to navigate, but ideal for those who wanted secrecy above all else. The idea that Roanoke and the surrounding islands were already familiar to someone before the English arrived begins to feel less like fantasy and more like a missing chapter of a larger story. When Sir Walter Raleigh later planned his expeditions, he received counsel from individuals known for their connection to esoteric knowledge. Men like John Dee, who believed in lost civilizations across the ocean and studied ancient maritime charts that shouldn't have existed. Some of these maps contained geometric symbols closely tied to Templar and Proto-Masonic traditions. Raleigh himself was rumored to be part of secret societies, groups that believed the New World held remnants of sacred knowledge lost in Europe. If these men suspected that earlier European visitors, perhaps even Templars, had left traces in the Americas, then Roanoke's selection as a colony site gains a completely new dimension. It raises an unsettling possibility. The English weren't the first to see Roanoke. They were returning to a location someone else had marked, a place whose significance was known only to a select circle of mystics and navigators. And the colonists, unaware of these deeper motives, may have stumbled into a narrative older and more complex than they were told. The Templar exodus and the vanishing fleet leave behind a vacuum in the historical record. Somewhere those ships went. Somewhere those men disembarked. Somewhere they hid whatever they were desperate to protect, whether documents, relics, or knowledge forbidden by European authorities. And when you look across the Atlantic at the strange, silent disappearance of Roanoke, you begin to wonder if two disappearances, one in 1307 and one in 1590, might be connected by a hidden current flowing beneath the surface of history. Perhaps Roanoke wasn't the first colony on that land. Perhaps it was the second. Perhaps, without realizing it, the English settled on ground that held older secrets, secrets they were never meant to uncover, secrets that may have swallowed them entirely. Long before Roanoke was drawn onto English charts, the coastline it rested upon had already appeared, quietly, mysteriously, and impossibly, on maps that should not have had any knowledge of the Americas. These maps are more than strange historical artifacts. They are fractures in the accepted timeline, glimpses into a hidden geography preserved by secret hands. They form a shadow archive, a network of cartographic whispers that suggest Old World explorers reached the American coastline centuries earlier than official history acknowledges. And at the heart of these uncanny documents lies a question that refuses to fade. Who drew these maps, and what knowledge were they trying to protect? To understand why these maps matter, imagine an era when cartography was both science and sorcery. Maps were treasured, guarded, and encoded. They were symbols of power, capable of guiding fleets, claiming empires, and revealing worlds no one had publicly admitted existed. In the medieval and early Renaissance periods, accurate maps weren't shared openly. They were hoarded in monasteries, royal vaults, and the Aponts. Violent preemptive action ignited further distrust among tribes who observed the encounter. The killing of Wingina did not simply sever a political bond, it shattered spiritual harmony. His death disrupted the sacred order that bound the Secotan world. To nearby tribes, the English became dangerous, unpredictable beings capable of murdering leaders and calling unknown forces into the land. Some groups withdrew entirely, isolating themselves. Others prepared for retaliation. Still others turned to ritual specialists, medicine men, shamans, and dream interpreters, seeking guidance on how to deal with these foreign disturbances. Yet conflict did not always take the form of open warfare. While some tribes might have wished to expel the English, direct confrontation was risky. Instead, they relied on subtle tactics, limiting food exchanges, isolating the settlers, withholding information about the land, and subtly guiding them into misunderstandings that increased their vulnerability. The colonists, already weakened by hunger and disease, interpreted the silence and withdrawal as betrayal, unaware that they were being ushered, gently but decisively, toward collapse. Among the tribes that interacted with Roanoke, one in particular stood out, the Croatan. Their relationship with the English was warmer, more open, and perhaps even strategic. Some theories suggest the Croatan viewed the settlers as potential buffers against hostile inland tribes. Others propose a deeper layer, that the Croatan possessed myths, prophecies, or ancestral memories that made them more sympathetic to the arrival of pale-skinned outsiders. Some later legends recorded by early ethnographers even suggest the Croatan may have seen the English as returning visitors, echoing ancient stories of pale travelers who came from the sea long ago. If the Croatan had a more harmonious worldview regarding the settlers, this placed them in a precarious political position. Welcoming foreigners could alienate neighboring tribes who viewed the English with suspicion or fear. This tension may explain why the Croatan often acted as intermediaries, carefully choosing what information to pass along and what to conceal. They were navigating a dangerous landscape, trying to help the settlers without provoking their own rivals. Internal pressures also shaped tribal behavior during the Roanoke period. Environmental strain, poor harvests, storms, and shifting animal populations created resource competition. Spiritual signs, omens, and dreams played a role. If their shamans declared the English an unbalanced presence or a source of disruption, tribes were compelled to react, not merely through politics, but through ritual demands. The colonists had no understanding of this spiritual dimension, yet it influenced every decision made around them. One lesser-known factor involves the influence of distant tribes far beyond Roanoke, some of whom had reputations for ritual warfare or for enforcing strict territorial boundaries. These larger powers, some hundreds of miles inland, held deep spiritual authority. Their decisions echoed through the entire region. If word reached them of pale-skinned settlers bringing disease or disrupting sacred spaces, they might have instructed coastal tribes to act or to withdraw. The English, perceiving only the immediate interactions, never realized the broader network of power that operated beyond their sight. Complicating matters further, prophetic traditions played a subtle but important role. Many tribes believed in cyclical eras, each marked by signs and upheavals. The arrival of strange humans from across the sea, bringing sickness and metal tools, might have been interpreted as the beginning of a new era, one that required drastic action or spiritual realignment. To the colonists, tribal hesitance or sudden hostility seemed unpredictable. But within the indigenous worldview, these responses were deliberate, rooted in visions, rituals, and interpretations handed down across generations. In this tense and evolving landscape, misunderstandings were inevitable. English attempts at diplomacy were interpreted as power grabs. Tribal gestures of warning were seen as threats. Spiritual boundaries were crossed unknowingly. Political alliances were misread, sometimes disastrously. Each misstep pushed the settlers deeper into isolation. By the time the colony began to unravel, tribal divisions were no longer external forces pressing against them. They had become invisible currents, shaping the colonists' fate at every turn. Some tribes may have chosen to absorb the lost settlers, believing integration would restore balance. Others may have avoided them entirely, fearing contamination or spiritual danger. and still others may have taken more decisive action to ensure the disturbance vanished into the forest and did not spread. The English thought they were founding a new world. In reality, they had stepped into an ancient one, intricate, spiritually charged, and fraught with unseen conflicts. They were strangers in a world whose rules they never learned, surrounded by tensions far older than their colony, pressures that would ultimately determine their fate long before any rescue ship arrived to find Roanoke silent and abandoned. The forest that surrounded Roanoke was not merely a collection of trees, marshes, and hidden waterways. To the English, it appeared ancient, primordial, and untouched. But to the native peoples who had lived there for generations, the land was layered with stories, patterns, and meanings, some spoken openly, and others reserved only for those initiated into deeper traditions. When the colonists stepped into these woods, they were not entering empty wilderness. They were walking into a living archive of mythic memory, sacred geography, and whispers carried through time. Everything had a name, a spirit, a history. Nothing was random, and nothing was without consequence. To understand this, one must step into the worldview of the Algonquian-speaking tribes who populated the region, including the Secotán, the Croatan, and the Pamlico. For them, the land was alive. Rivers were not simply waterways, but arteries of the earth, carrying spiritual currents as much as physical ones. The forest contained watchers, spirits, ancestors, animal guides, who communicated through dreams, omens, and the sudden hush of wind through branches. Mountains, even distant ones, held power. Islands were often thresholds, places where the boundary between the physical and the spirit world thinned. Roanoke Island, long before the English set foot on it, was considered one such threshold. Stories told by elders describe a time when supernatural beings walked openly among the people. Some were benevolent, teaching skills and bringing harmony. Others were deceptive, luring humans off paths or deeper into shadows where they would vanish without a trace. The colonists, unfamiliar with this cosmology, often interpreted these tales as superstition. But the details within them, the warnings, the patterns of disappearances, the descriptions of strange lights and voices, carry remarkable parallels to the later events surrounding the colony's fate. One recurring figure in Algonquian legend is the trickster spirit, sometimes referred to as a shapeshifter capable of appearing in human, animal, or even spectral form. The stories insist that such beings guard certain sacred places and become hostile when outsiders disturb them. The forest surrounding Roanoke was said to be filled with territories belonging to these spirits, areas where hunting was forbidden or where travelers moved with great caution, carrying protective charms and speaking specific prayers. English settlers, lacking this knowledge, wandered freely into zones the local people avoided. Encounters described by the colonists, strange cries at night, inexplicable footprints, sudden illnesses, begin to take on an entirely different meaning when filtered through the lens of native spiritual geography. Even more compelling are the myths surrounding the Pale Ones, beings described as arriving from the sea long before European contact. These figures appear in multiple tribal stories along the eastern seaboard, often associated with both danger and prophecy. According to some versions, these mysterious visitors brought advanced knowledge or strange objects. In others, they caused upheaval, disease, or war. A few stories speak of the Pale Ones building temporary settlements, then retreating inland or vanishing altogether. Their presence left marks, stone structures, strange symbols burned into trees, or paths carved where no paths should be. For centuries, these legends were dismissed as later inventions influenced by European arrival. But archaeological hints across the Outer Banks suggest contact long before the English came. One particularly chilling legend tells of a tribe that once thrived near the coast, possessing unusual tools and a unique language. They lived apart from other tribes, guarded by enigmatic leaders who practiced rituals unknown anywhere else. Then, without warning, it disappeared entirely, leaving only fragments of pottery, abandoned shelters, and stories of a summoning that called them back across the ocean or into another realm. Local tribes viewed the site of their vanished village as cursed thereafter, warning children never to wander near it. The placement of this legend, interestingly, aligns with coastal regions not far from Roanoke. Another layer of mystery comes from the concept of liminal locations, places where different realms overlap. Islands, river mouths, marshes, and the edges of dense forests all fall into this category. Roanoke Island, bordered by shifting sands and waters that change with storms and tides, was believed to be a crossroads between worlds. Even within the island, certain clearings or peculiar arrangements of stones were treated as taboo. The English, unable to read these signs, unknowingly built homes and fortifications upon sites that native peoples regarded as spiritually volatile or forbidden. There are also stories about a great darkness that once spread through the land, causing people to flee or hide. In some accounts, this darkness is symbolic, representing war or famine. In others, it is described more literally, a force that moved like a storm, accompanied by strange lights, sickness, and voices calling out from the trees. Tribal shamans performed rituals to contain it, sealing off particular areas and marking them with signs that outsiders would not recognize. If any of these sealed zones lay near or beneath the English settlement, the consequences would have been immediate and unpredictable. Dreams played an important role in native life, guiding decisions and providing warnings. Several tribes reported that, around the time the English arrived, their spiritual leaders saw visions of two worlds colliding, of shadows swallowing people whole, and of strangers being taken by forces they did not understand. These warnings were passed quietly among the tribes. Some groups avoided contact with the colonists entirely. Others attempted to warn them, but their messages were ignored or misinterpreted. There are even legends describing beings who guard ancient knowledge buried deep within the region. Knowledge said to be tied to stars, to long-forgotten travelers, or to objects hidden beneath the earth. Some of these stories include references to symbols uncannily similar to those associated with Old World secret societies. How these motifs entered the mythology remains unclear. Perhaps they were borrowed from earlier contact. Perhaps something older, deeper, and more ancient than any recorded human history left its mark there. In some variations, the guardians of this hidden knowledge are not spirits, but human-like beings who lived in secluded enclaves, practicing rituals that preserved cosmic balance. When outsiders approached their territory, they were known to remove them silently, without violence, simply erasing their presence as though they had never existed. Taken into the woods, the stories say, and not returned. To the settlers, the forest around Roanoke was a place to gather timber, hunt game, and explore. To the native tribes, it was a labyrinth of sacred spaces, warnings, and ancient presences. The misunderstandings surrounding these differing worldviews created tension long before any overt conflict. The colonists walked into a land filled with unseen rules, spirits that demanded respect, and histories far older than their maps or ambitions. When strange events began happening to the settlers, disappearances, unexplained noises, sudden hostility from previously welcoming tribes, the English blamed starvation, weather, or political mistrust. But to the locals, these were signs that the balance had been disturbed, that something had been awakened or offended. The island was speaking, the spirits responding, the boundaries shifting. And at the heart of it all, Roanoke, quiet, ancient, and wrapped in myth, held on to its secrets as it always had. The colonists, unaware of the depth of meaning woven into the land beneath their feet, stood on the edge of a world whose rules they did not understand. And the land, in turn, watched them with silence older than any empire, waiting for the moment when myth and reality would converge once more. When the English settled Roanoke, they believed their greatest challenges would be hunger, weather, or the unpredictable currents of the Atlantic. What they did not anticipate were the strange, unsettling phenomena that began almost as soon as the first houses were built. These were the kinds of events that rarely make their way into official records, because they exist in that ambiguous space between fear, superstition, and genuine mystery. Yet the fragments we do have, combined with later testimonies, suggest that something deeply unusual was happening on and around the island. The colonists encountered experiences that defied rational explanation, patterns that echoed native stories, and phenomena that would grow stranger as their isolation deepened. The wilderness surrounding the settlement did not behave like ordinary forest land. Settlers described moments when the trees fell into unnatural silence. No birdsong, no shifting leaves, no insects. The entire world holding its breath as if watching them. Hunters reported sudden patches of mist that appeared without warning, sometimes carrying the faint sound of voices they could not place. Others spoke of hearing footsteps in the underbrush, heavy and deliberate, only to find no tracks when they investigated. One man claimed he heard a child crying deep in the woods, though no families had reported a missing child at the time. These experiences spread quietly among the colonists, whispered in hushed conversations, dismissed publicly as nerves or fatigue, but never forgotten. Night brought even stranger occurrences. The colonists noted lights moving across the treetops, glowing orbs drifting silently like lanterns carried by invisible hands. At first, they attributed these to native watchfires, but the lights behaved in ways impossible for humans. They rose straight upward, dipped sharply, vanished suddenly, or drifted into the sky before flickering out. Some settlers believed they were spirits or warnings. Others feared they were signals between unseen groups. One journal fragment described a bluish light that hovered above the settlement for several minutes, illuminating the rooftops with a glow brighter than moonlight. The writer compared it to a wandering star brought low to observe us. The sounds of the island added another layer of unease. The wind, shaped by the barrier islands and marshlands, carried distant echoes that seemed almost deliberate. Colonists described hearing rhythmic drumming at night, sometimes faint, sometimes alarmingly close, though they could never locate the source. The local tribes insisted they were not responsible for these drumbeats, claiming such sounds belonged to older forces in the land. At times, the settlers heard voices calling out from the water, words in no language they recognized, rising and falling with the waves. Fishermen reported splashes far too large to be fish and shadows beneath the surface that moved against the current. Even the animals behaved unpredictably. Deer avoided the settlement entirely. Dogs barked at empty corners of the woods. Birds sometimes erupted into mass flight for no reason. On more than one occasion, fish washed ashore in strange patterns, as if driven by something unseen beneath the waves. Several colonists recorded dreams of being followed through dense forests by figures they could never fully see, figures that moved silently, gliding rather than walking, always just beyond the edge of perception. One of the most disturbing incidents involved the sudden appearance of carved symbols on the trees surrounding the colony. These markings seemed to appear overnight, geometric shapes, crosses, spirals, and lines that resembled a mixture of native iconography and old-world esoteric signs. Some colonists swore they had not been there the day before. Others believed local tribes had placed them as warnings. But the tribes, when questioned, denied any involvement. They claimed the symbols belonged to an older culture, or perhaps to spirits who walked during transitional periods between seasons. Some settlers recognized the symbols, not from the New World, but from manuscripts and carvings they had seen back home, symbols associated with mystical orders and whispered teachings never spoken aloud. As fear grew, the colonists began dividing into two camps. One group believed the land itself was hostile, haunted, or cursed, some invisible presence watching them, waiting for them to fail. These settlers grew paranoid, avoiding the woods entirely, insisting the colony build more defensive walls and stay near the beach. The other group believed the phenomena were caused by people, either hostile tribes, Spanish agents, or secretive groups with their own agenda. They insisted that the strange lights, footprints, and disappearances were tactics meant to intimidate or confuse them. But even this explanation offered little comfort. For if humans were responsible, then they were people who could traverse the woods silently, appear and vanish at will, and observe the settlement without ever being seen. Some of the strangest accounts involved disappearances. A hunter left at dawn and never returned. Search parties found only his footprints, ending abruptly as though he had been lifted off the ground. A woman gathering herbs along the edge of the clearing heard her name whispered from behind her. When she turned, no one was there, but she saw impressions in the tall grass, as though someone invisible had brushed past. A child claimed to see a pale figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching silently. When adults checked the spot, they found nothing except a faint indentation in the soil, as if someone had been standing there moments before. In the colonist journals, there are hints, brief notations, abandoned sentences, suggesting that some settlers believed they were being followed by a group older than the local tribes, a people who moved through the land like ghosts. One entry noted, "There are eyes upon us that do not belong to man." Another wrote, "The woods do not welcome us. They are not empty. They know we are strangers." As weeks turned into months, the colonists began noticing patterns, events that repeated at specific moon phases, strange noises that occurred at the same hour each night, lights that appeared only after certain storms. These patterns hinted at intention, as though the phenomena were part of a larger system, a ritual, or a sequence tied to the land's deeper rhythms. Even the tides behaved oddly at times, retreating too far or surging inward without storms to explain them. Some settlers suspected that the land itself was reacting to their presence. Others believed that someone, or something, was controlling these forces, manipulating signs, sounds, and shapes to create fear, confusion, or submission. The idea that they were walking within a living system, one they could not interpret, took root slowly but irrevocably. By the end, the colonists were no longer just battling hunger or isolation. They were contending with a landscape that behaved like a sentient entity, filled with signs they could not read and shadows that seemed to move with purpose. The island's mysteries grew tighter around them, as though drawing them into a web woven long before they arrived. And in that gathering darkness, half natural, half supernatural, the colony began to unravel, one strange occurrence at a time, until the line between fear and reality dissolved entirely. By the time the English carved out their fragile foothold on Roanoke, they entered a landscape already shaped by rising tensions, invisible boundaries, and political fractures among the tribes who lived along the Carolina coast. The colonists believed themselves to be the first Europeans to establish a true settlement in the region. But they were stepping into the middle of a long and complex network of alliances, rivalries, and ancient grievances, forces they neither understood nor respected. What might appear from afar as a single unified world of native peoples was, in reality, a shifting constellation of competing tribes, each influenced by its own history, spiritual laws, and territorial claims. The English, unaware of the delicate balance at play, quickly became entangled in conflicts older and deeper than they knew. The Algonquian-speaking tribes that surrounded Roanoke were not governed by a centralized authority. Instead, they existed in a dynamic tension, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing, always negotiating power through ritual, diplomacy, and skirmish. The Secretan, who initially welcomed the English with cautious hospitality, were themselves at odds with neighboring groups like the Wepamiak and the Chowanoak. Further inland, more powerful confederacies held influence, including the fearsome Tuscarora, warriors known for fiercely defending their territory and punishing those who overstepped boundaries. While the English believed they could simply integrate themselves into these political networks, they misread the undercurrents entirely. From the beginning, the colonists found themselves aligned, however unintentionally, with the wrong factions. By accepting food, shelter, or favor from one tribe, they appeared to be choosing sides, which immediately placed them in opposition to others. As these perceptions hardened, rival tribes began viewing the English not as harmless newcomers, but as potential military allies, resource competitors, or intruders threatening the spiritual and ecological balance of the land. The colonists themselves, exhausted, hungry, and desperate, were often unaware that each exchange, each gesture, each gift held political weight. The figure of Wingina, the Secretan leader, demonstrates the complex dynamics the English stumbled into. Wingina initially saw the settlers as potential weapons in his own intertribal rivalries. He hoped that aligning with a powerful, technologically advanced foreign group would bolster his position against long-standing enemies. But as disease began to spread among his people, illnesses the English brought unknowingly, Wingina's perception shifted. Some accounts suggest he interpreted the sickness as a spiritual imbalance caused by their presence. Others describe that he believed the colonists wielded dark powers capable of harming or controlling life. Whether through fear, suspicion, or political calculation, Wingina turned against the English, setting off a chain of events that would shape the colony's downfall. The colonists interpreted Wingina's shifting attitude as betrayal, failing to understand the pressures he faced. Their response, violent preemptive action, ignited further distrust among tribes who observed the encounter. The killing of Wingina did not simply sever a political bond, it shattered spiritual harmony. His death disrupted the sacred order that bound the Secretan world. To nearby tribes, the English became dangerous, unpredictable beings capable of murdering leaders and calling unknown forces into the land. Some groups withdrew entirely, isolating themselves. Others prepared for retaliation. Still others turned to ritual specialists, medicine men, shamans, and dream interpreters, seeking guidance on how to deal with these foreign disturbances. Yet conflict did not always take the form of open warfare. While some tribes might have wished to expel the English, direct confrontation was risky. Instead, they relied on subtle tactics, limiting food exchanges, isolating the settlers, withholding information about the land, and subtly guiding them into misunderstandings that increased their vulnerability. The colonists, already weakened by hunger and disease, interpreted the silence and withdrawal as betrayal, unaware that they were being ushered, gently but decisively, toward collapse. Among the tribes that interacted with Roanoke, one in particular stood out, the Croatan. Their relationship with the English was warmer, more open, and perhaps even strategic. Some theories suggest the Croatan viewed the settlers as potential buffers against hostile inland tribes. Others propose a deeper layer, that the Croatan possessed myths, prophecies, or ancestral memories that made them more sympathetic to the arrival of pale-skinned outsiders. Some later legends recorded by early ethnographers even suggest the Croatan may have seen the English as returning visitors, echoing ancient stories of pale travelers who came from the sea long ago. If the Croatan had a more harmonious worldview regarding the settlers, this placed them in a precarious political position. Welcoming foreigners could alienate neighboring tribes who viewed the English with suspicion or fear. This tension may explain why the Croatan often acted as intermediaries, carefully choosing what information to pass along and what to conceal. They were navigating a dangerous landscape, trying to help the settlers without provoking their own rivals. Internal pressures also shaped tribal behavior during the Roanoke period. Environmental strain, poor harvests, storms, and shifting animal populations created resource competition. Spiritual signs, omens, and dreams played a role. If their shamans declared the English an unbalanced presence or source of disruption, tribes were compelled to react, not merely through politics, but through ritual demands. The colonists had no understanding of this spiritual dimension, yet it influenced every decision made around them. One lesser-known factor involves the influence of distant tribes far beyond Roanoke, some of whom had reputations for ritual warfare or for enforcing strict territorial boundaries. These larger powers, some hundreds of miles inland, held deep spiritual authority. Their decisions echoed through the entire region. If word reached them of pale-skinned settlers bringing disease or disrupting sacred spaces, they might have instructed coastal tribes to act or to withdraw. The English, perceiving only the immediate interactions, never realized the broader network of power that operated beyond their sight. Complicating matters further, prophetic traditions played a subtle but important role. Many tribes believed in cyclical eras, each marked by signs and upheavals. The arrival of strange humans from across the sea, bringing sickness and metal tools, might have been interpreted as the beginning of a new era, one that required drastic action or spiritual realignment. To the colonists, tribal hesitance or sudden hostility seemed unpredictable. But within the indigenous worldview, these responses were deliberate, rooted in visions, rituals, and interpretations handed down across generations. In this tense and evolving landscape, misunderstandings were inevitable. English attempts at diplomacy were interpreted as power grabs. Tribal gestures of warning were seen as threats. Spiritual boundaries were crossed unknowingly. Political alliances were misread, sometimes disastrously. Each misstep pushed the settlers deeper into isolation. By the time the colony began to unravel, tribal divisions were no longer external forces pressing against them. They'd become invisible currents, shaping the colonists' fate at every turn. Some tribes may have chosen to absorb the lost settlers, believing integration would restore balance. Others may have avoided them entirely, fearing contamination or spiritual danger. And still others may have taken more decisive action to ensure the disturbance vanished into the forest and did not spread. The English thought they were founding a new world. In reality, they had stepped into an ancient one, intricate, spiritually charged, and fraught with unseen conflicts. They were strangers in a world whose rules they never learned, surrounded by tensions far older than their colony, pressures that would ultimately determine their fate long before any rescue ship arrived to find Roanoke silent and abandoned. Long before Roanoke became synonymous with disappearance, the English colony lived through a slow, almost imperceptible unraveling, one that did not happen suddenly, but through a steady accumulation of stresses, hidden fractures, and quiet collapses. The image often painted in school books is one of a simple, straightforward struggle: starvation, storms, lack of supplies. But the truth is far more complex. The colony's breakdown was not the result of a single catastrophic event, but of layered tensions, emotional, political, psychological, and spiritual, that intertwined until the community, once hopeful and determined, grew fragile, anxious, and divided. By tracing these cracks, we can understand how the settlers were pushed toward decisions increasingly desperate, risky, and unthinkable. The first signs of deterioration emerged not in the form of starvation or conflict, but in something far subtler: the gradual erosion of collective purpose. At the beginning, the settlers believed they were part of an ambitious plan, an English foothold in the New World, a place where they could prosper, trade, and expand. However, when the promised resupplies failed to arrive, that belief began to fray. Each passing month without a ship on the horizon felt like a betrayal. Letters went unanswered. Tools broke. Food stores dwindled. And slowly, the settlers realized they were no longer an extension of England, but a stranded community with no authority to appeal to and no guarantee of rescue. This disillusionment led to internal divisions. Not all colonists shared the same goals or expectations. Some were loyal to the vision of building an English city of Raleigh. Others had come for trade, adventure, or the faint hope of wealth. A few simply wanted stability, farmland, or escape from troubles back home. As conditions grew harsher, these differing motivations became fractures. Arguments broke out over land, leadership, and responsibility. Small disputes over stolen rations, damaged tools, or failed hunting trips turned personal. Whispered rumors circulated in the settlement at night. Accusations of laziness, sabotage, or secret alliances with local tribes. Leaders struggled to maintain order. With dwindling supplies, they imposed strict rationing, which in turn bred resentment. Those tasked with distributing food faced constant accusations of favoritism. Hunters who returned empty-handed were suspected of hiding meat. The atmosphere grew tense, suspicious, and increasingly volatile. People began sleeping lightly, keeping tools close at hand, fearing theft or worse. It was not starvation alone that weakened the colony. It was the collapse of trust. Psychologically, the isolation took a heavy toll. Many settlers had never traveled far from home before. Now, they found themselves on an island thousands of miles from the world they knew, surrounded by dense forests, unfamiliar wildlife, and people whose languages and customs they struggled to understand. The nights were long, filled with unsettling noises, dreams distorted by hunger, and the lingering feeling of being watched. Some colonists became withdrawn, speaking rarely, staring into the fire for hours. Others grew restless, pacing the settlement or wandering into the woods despite warnings. A few exhibited signs of what modern psychology might call acute stress or dissociation, muttering to themselves, experiencing visions, or becoming convinced that something in the forest was calling to them. Illness added another layer of distress. The colonists lacked immunity to the new world's microbial landscape. Fevers, infections, and mysterious ailments began spreading. Some families lost multiple members in a single season. As bodies weakened, so did morale. There were periods when the colonists seemed almost resigned, moving mechanically through their tasks with little hope of change. Fear of sickness created new divisions. Healthy individuals avoided the sick, creating pockets of isolation within the already small community. The bowstring tension between the colonists and local tribes intensified the psychological strain. Each tribe had its own reasons for approaching or avoiding the settlement. Some offered help cautiously. Others withdrew without explanation. The colonists, lacking cultural understanding, misinterpreted gestures and rituals, leading to misunderstandings that deepened isolation. Every change in tribal behavior, every sudden refusal to trade, every cryptic message, every warning delivered in subtle symbolism, was interpreted as a sign of danger. The settlers could never be certain whether they were safe, watched, or quietly surrounded. The landscape itself added pressure. Storms battered the island, flooding gardens and damaging structures. Hurricanes carved through the coastline, reshaping sandbanks and destroying fishing weirs. With each violent storm, the settlers felt more and more at the mercy of an environment they could not predict. Some believed the land was cursed or hostile. Others said the earth rejected them, that it wanted them gone. These whispered fears influenced decisions more than anyone admitted aloud. Amid all this external stress, leadership faltered. With John White, governor and one of the colony's strongest stabilizing influences, gone for supplies, the settlers were left with no unified authority. Temporary leaders lacked White's diplomacy and understanding of both English tensions and native customs. They struggled to mediate disputes, negotiate with tribes, or enforce rules. Without strong guidance, factions emerged. Groups of settlers began forming their own plans and quietly separating their resources. Some proposed abandoning the settlement. Others suggested forming alliances with specific tribes. A few advocated moving inland to seek better soil and stronger communities. These conflicting visions created tension that simmered beneath every daily task. Religion, which might have unified the settlers, instead became another source of conflict. Some colonists believed the strange phenomena and repeated hardships were signs of divine wrath. They blamed sinful behaviors, lack of prayer, or improper rituals. Others believed the land itself possessed spiritual forces that were not Christian, forces that needed appeasing or avoidance. These differing interpretations deepened the psychological divide. Some settlers turned fervently to their Bibles. Others sought meaning in dreams, omens, and symbols they encountered around the island. A few whispered that the native stories might hold truth the English had ignored. As conditions deteriorated, desperation pushed the settlers into actions they would never have considered during the early days of the colony. Secret meetings were held at night, away from the main settlement. Resources were hidden. Exploratory groups disappeared into the forest for days at a time. Some never returned. Whispers spread of people planning to leave Roanoke entirely, either to join friendly tribes, move inland, or attempt to build rafts and sail south along the coast. Each clandestine plan created new fractures, feeding a cycle of distrust that corroded the colony from within. By the late stages of the settlement, the colonists lived in an atmosphere heavy with fear, superstition, and silence. They spoke less, avoided discussing the unexplained events around them, and focused on basic survival. But inside, every person carried a private burden, a gnawing dread that they were trapped in a place that did not want them, watched by forces they could not understand, and slowly unraveling, both as individuals and as a community. When the colony finally vanished, it was not the result of a single decisive moment, but the culmination of these layered pressures. The settlers' disappearance was the final act of a breakdown that had begun long before. The moment when the fragile bonds holding them together finally dissolved, leaving the settlement empty, the fires cold, and only the silent forest remaining as witness. In the final stretch before the colony's disappearance, an atmosphere of profound uncertainty settled over Roanoke, weaving itself into every conversation, every moment of work, and every quiet hour of restless sleep. The settlers had endured years of strain, emotional wear, dwindling supplies, fear of the unknown. But what emerged in these last days was something deeper and more disorienting. The sense that time itself was running out, that they stood on the edge of a decision that would determine whether they lived or died. This growing urgency did not come from one single event, but from a slow build-up of signs, subtle, persistent warnings that the island could no longer sustain them. Yet even as these signals pointed toward an inevitable departure, the colonists were divided over the path forward. Rumors spread quietly among families, whispered only within the safety of their small shelters. Some settlers spoke of omens observed in the forest, strange movements of animals, unnatural quiet at dusk, or symbols carved into trees that no colonist claimed responsibility for. Whether these signs were natural or human-made, the effect was the same. The colonists felt watched. A few began insisting that staying on the island meant inviting catastrophe. They argued that even if supply ships arrived, they might come too late. For them, leaving was not a gamble. It was a necessity. Others hesitated. Leaving the settlement meant abandoning the structures they had spent years building. It also meant entering a landscape they barely understood, filled with tribes whose loyalties shifted with political tensions and seasonal pressures. Still, many settlers recognized that remaining on Roanoke was no longer sustainable. Food sources had become unpredictable. Gardens failed more often than they succeeded. Even the sea seemed unwilling to provide, as fishing yields dropped sharply, perhaps due to storms altering coastal patterns. The island that once promised opportunity now felt like a place closing its doors. As desperation deepened, the colonists held lengthy discussions, some public, others in secret. Groups formed around competing visions of survival. A portion of the community believed they should move inland toward tribal settlements known to be more stable, hoping that absorbing into a larger population would offer safety. They argued that cooperation, not isolation, was the key to enduring. Others wanted to travel south, toward areas rumored to have fertile land and friendlier tribes. A few even suggested building crude boats and attempting to sail north toward Chesapeake Bay, believing that Raleigh's original instructions had pointed them in that direction. Yet each plan carried immense risk, and the settlers knew that a single wrong decision could doom the entire group. Despite these divisions, a quiet consensus began to take shape. Staying on Roanoke meant certain collapse. The question was no longer whether to leave, but how, when, and with whom. Families prepared silently, gathering tools, preserving what little food they had, and crafting makeshift packs. Children sensed the tension and asked questions their parents struggled to answer. People moved through the settlement with a solemn purpose, not panicked, but resigned, as if accepting a fate they could no longer resist or delay. In this period, relationships with local tribes became even more critical. Some tribes extended cautious offers of help, suggesting temporary relocation or shared resources. Others kept their distance, unsure whether the colonists' presence brought danger or imbalance. The settlers understood that their next steps would depend heavily on these fragile alliances. They held meetings with tribal leaders, exchanging gifts, gestures of goodwill, and promises of mutual benefit. Even so, misunderstandings were common, and every interaction carried uncertainty. One wrong word or misinterpreted sign could shatter the delicate rapport they had built. As the settlers prepared to leave, they faced a final dilemma: how to ensure that anyone returning from England, if such a ship ever came, would know where they had gone. They discussed leaving markers, symbols, or written notes, but the fear of hostile forces discovering their trail complicated everything. They wanted to leave a message clear enough for their own people, yet obscure enough to avoid exploitation by anyone who meant them harm. This balance of clarity and secrecy weighed heavily on their minds. The last nights on Roanoke were filled with restless sleep and quiet reflection. Fires burned low. Tools were cleaned and wrapped. Families gathered for meals that were thinner than ever, yet shared with more tenderness, aware that the familiar was slipping away. Some settlers prayed for guidance. Others simply stared into the darkness, listening to the wind in the trees and wondering whether the path ahead would bring salvation or oblivion. When the colony finally made its decision, it was not with triumph or certainty, but with sober determination. They understood that their survival depended on movement, on stepping beyond the confines of the island into a world full of unknowns. With measured steps, they dismantled what they could, buried what they could not carry, and made their preparations to leave behind the place that had both sheltered and haunted them. Their departure was quiet, deliberate, and heavy with the weight of everything they had endured. The moment the settlers walked away from Roanoke was not a vanishing act, but the culmination of fear, necessity, and the fragile hope that somewhere beyond the horizon lay a future they could still claim. They left behind an empty settlement, silent structures, and the faint traces of lives interrupted, but they did so with the conviction that their only chance for survival lay in moving forward into the unknown. Modern archaeology has long struggled to explain the enigma of Roanoke. Despite centuries of investigation, the physical evidence of the colony's existence remains frustratingly sparse, and what little has been found often raises more questions than it answers. Small fragments of pottery, tools, and structural remnants have been uncovered over the decades. Yet none of these discoveries seem to paint a complete picture of the settlement or the fate of its people. The mystery deepens when examining artifacts that defy easy explanation. Certain tools and implements, for instance, appear unusually sophisticated for a fledgling colony, leading some researchers to speculate that these items were not merely utilitarian, but may have been imbued with a deeper symbolic or ceremonial significance. Others have suggested that the artifacts were intentionally left behind, part of a coded message meant for those who knew how to read it. In this context, archaeology becomes almost like a game of cryptography, where every shard of pottery or carved piece of wood could potentially hold a hidden message about the Templars' presence or intentions. One of the most tantalizing aspects of these archaeological whispers is the recurring appearance of symbols that seem oddly reminiscent of European esoteric traditions. Carvings on wooden beams and rudimentary stone layouts have been found that bear a faint resemblance to Templar iconography, though such interpretations are always debated among scholars. Some historians dismiss these connections as coincidental, pointing out that crosses, geometric patterns, and abstract symbols are common across many cultures. Yet, when these symbols are considered alongside historical records of Templar migration and secret networks, a pattern begins to emerge, one that suggests Roanoke may have been more than just an ordinary English colony. It is not simply the presence of the artifacts themselves that captivates the imagination, but the careful, almost deliberate arrangement in which they are discovered. Certain objects seem positioned in ways that align with cardinal directions or with known celestial markers, hinting at knowledge of navigation, astronomy, or sacred geometry that would have been highly unusual for ordinary settlers. Adding another layer to this mystery is the story of purportedly lost artifacts. Over the centuries, various items have surfaced in private collections or in unverified archaeological reports. Fragments of metalwork, unusual stones, and carved wooden objects. Many of these items cannot be traced to any documented excavation, which fuels speculation about clandestine discoveries or even the possibility that some artifacts were deliberately concealed by those who stumbled upon them. There are whispers that some objects may have been smuggled out of the area by secretive parties, potentially including descendants of the colony who wish to preserve Templar knowledge away from the scrutiny of colonial authorities. These rumors are impossible to verify fully, yet they persist because they fit neatly into a larger narrative of secrecy, suppression, and the ongoing quest to understand what really happened to Roanoke. Archaeological digs have occasionally uncovered more concrete signs of habitation that invite further speculation. Foundations of dwellings, traces of hearths, and remnants of fencing provide glimpses of everyday life. But these too are tantalizingly incomplete. Skeletal remains are almost entirely absent, and there is little evidence of sudden mass destruction, which would be expected if the colony had been attacked. Instead, the remnants suggest a gradual disappearance or relocation, an outcome that aligns disturbingly well with theories of secretive Templar involvement. If these settlers were indeed safeguarding something precious, perhaps they abandoned the settlement intentionally, leaving only cryptic hints for those who might follow. This theory is strengthened by the fact that certain areas around Roanoke contain unusually high concentrations of stone alignments and earthworks whose purposes remain unexplained. Could these have served as ceremonial or protective structures, carefully placed to shield hidden knowledge or relics? While mainstream archaeology hesitates to assign mystical significance to these formations, the patterns they create cannot be entirely ignored. Adding to the intrigue is the peculiar timing of some of the artifacts' discoveries. Many items have surfaced decades, or even centuries, after the colony's disappearance, as if the land itself is slowly revealing its secrets. This slow unveiling creates a sense of tension and anticipation, reinforcing the idea that the truth about Roanoke is layered, deliberate, and obscured. Modern technology, such as ground-penetrating radar and advanced surveying techniques, has begun to shed light on previously inaccessible areas, uncovering foundations, post holes, and artifacts buried beneath layers of soil. Some of these finds suggest complex construction patterns that are difficult to reconcile with the limited resources and population of the original settlers, again hinting at outside assistance or specialized knowledge, possibly linked to Templar traditions. Each new discovery, no matter how small, adds a piece to the puzzle, yet also raises new questions, keeping the mystery alive and inviting continued speculation. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of these archaeological whispers is what is not found. The absence of human remains, for instance, is profoundly unsettling and has led some researchers to propose that the settlers were either moved deliberately by a secretive faction or integrated with local tribes who serve as custodians of their knowledge. Some believe that certain artifacts may have been intended as markers or guides for those who understood the colony's deeper purpose, hidden in plain sight for centuries until the right observers came along. This interplay of presence and absence, revelation and concealment, transforms the archaeological record into something almost narrative in its complexity. Roanoke is not simply a lost colony. It is a living enigma, speaking to us through fragments of pottery, weathered carvings, and subtle alignments of earth and stone, urging us to look closer, think deeper, and question what we believe we know about history. Across the Atlantic, a web of whispers hints that the story of Roanoke did not end with the colony's disappearance. Some historians and researchers have suggested that a number of the settlers may have returned to Europe, either by choice or under the guidance of secretive networks, carrying with them knowledge, artifacts, or even sacred texts that have been hidden in the New World. These theories are often dismissed as fanciful, yet tantalizing fragments in European archives lend them a measure of credibility. Letters, ship logs, and merchant records from the late 16th and early 17th centuries occasionally refer to mysterious individuals with origins in Virginia or mentions of colonists who vanished beyond the seas. The details are cryptic and scarce, yet they suggest that some members of the Roanoke group may have traveled back to the continent in secret, perhaps to reunite with surviving factions of clandestine societies. In this light, Roanoke transforms from a simple tale of disappearance into a story of deliberate movement, concealment, and strategic relocation. The connection to the Knights Templar and their supposed networks becomes particularly intriguing in this context. Long after the order was officially disbanded in the early 14th century, whispers persisted that surviving Templars maintained secret chapters across Europe, safeguarding relics, manuscripts, and hidden knowledge. Some of these clandestine groups are believed to have sought refuge in remote regions or aligned themselves with sympathetic political figures, creating invisible pathways of influence. If the Roanoke settlers had indeed been associated with or influenced by these secretive factions, it would explain not only their sudden disappearance, but also the presence of sophisticated knowledge in the colony, far beyond what ordinary settlers would be expected to possess. Maps, navigational tools, and subtle alignments in the settlement itself hint at familiarity with esoteric practices, reinforcing the idea that the settlers were far from ordinary and may have been operating under the guidance of a hidden European network. European records occasionally reference enigmatic figures whose biographies appear to intersect with a vanished colony. Some of these individuals were described as carrying foreign manuscripts or possessing knowledge that could not be easily explained. A few scholars have suggested that these were descendants or direct associates of the Roanoke settlers who had returned to the continent, bringing with them secrets of a new world. These accounts are tantalizingly vague, often couched in the language of rumor, secrecy, or code, which raises the possibility that the information was deliberately obscured to protect sensitive knowledge. From the perspective of those seeking Templar connections, these references take on heightened significance. Could the settlers have been entrusted with guarding sacred relics, codes, or esoteric wisdom in a new world, and then returned to Europe to ensure its preservation? If so, the colony's disappearance would not be an accident, but a carefully orchestrated migration, a hidden chapter in a centuries-long saga of secrecy. In addition to textual evidence, there are subtle material clues suggesting a transatlantic flow of knowledge. Some artifacts purportedly linked to Roanoke have appeared in European collections, often under mysterious circumstances. These include unusually crafted metalwork, fragments of coded manuscripts, and objects bearing symbols that parallel those found in the settlement. While provenance is difficult to confirm, the consistency of these items with known Templar or esoteric motifs cannot be entirely dismissed. If genuine, they hint at a deliberate transfer of cultural and symbolic artifacts between the New World and Europe, possibly intended to preserve knowledge outside the reach of authorities who might seek to suppress it. The idea of a silent network, maintaining communication and safeguarding secrets across continents, aligns with broader theories of Templar survival and their role in guiding or protecting hidden wisdom. The possibility of European reintegration also raises questions about what the Roanoke settlers themselves knew or sought to achieve. Were they merely colonists caught in the currents of exploration, or were they part of a deliberate experiment, tasked with establishing a foothold in the New World to conceal treasures or knowledge from prying eyes? Some researchers propose that the colony's location was chosen with strategic intent, not only for its geographic qualities, but also for its symbolic significance, potentially tied to ancient maps, ley lines, or sacred geographies. If true, returning to Europe would have been necessary to relay discoveries, exchange intelligence with sympathetic allies, or preserve materials that could not safely remain in the New World. Each layer of evidence, no matter how subtle, contributes to a narrative of deliberate secrecy and intercontinental strategy, blurring the lines between historical fact, conspiracy, and esoteric tradition. Finally, the implications of these European connections extend far beyond the immediate fate of Roanoke. If settlers did return and integrate with secret networks, it suggests a continuity of knowledge, ritual, and perhaps even sacred mission stretching across centuries and continents. The Roanoke colony would no longer be merely a forgotten settlement, but a vital node in a hidden chain of custodianship, linking the esoteric knowledge of medieval Europe with the emerging New World. This perspective transforms our understanding of history, suggesting that the disappearance of the colony was not simply a local tragedy, but part of a much larger, deliberate effort to protect and transmit forbidden or sacred knowledge. The idea that echoes of Roanoke might still reverberate in European archives, private collections, and the very geography of Old World cities adds a haunting depth to the mystery, reminding us that history often hides more than it reveals, and that some truths may only emerge decades or centuries after the fact. One of the most compelling theories surrounding Roanoke is the possibility that the colony was a guardian of something far greater than mere settlement lands or survival supplies. Historians and esoteric researchers alike have long speculated that the settlers may have been entrusted with safeguarding treasures, sacred objects, or knowledge that had been passed down through clandestine networks, perhaps even tracing back to the Knights Templar themselves. This is not simply speculation rooted in fanciful imagination. Tantalizing clues in historical records, cryptic maps, and oral tradition suggest that certain items of immense cultural and spiritual significance may have been moved across the Atlantic with deliberate intent. The very choice of Roanoke's location, remote yet strategically positioned, hints at more than the convenience of exploration. Its isolation may have served as a natural vault, a secure space to conceal objects too precious or too dangerous to be left in Europe, where inquisitive eyes and political authorities could threaten their safety. Among the most frequently discussed possibilities are sacred relics, objects imbued with religious or ceremonial power, or artifacts that contained encoded knowledge. Some researchers point to the recurring presence of crosses, geometric designs, and peculiar engravings in both the colony and surviving European records, suggesting a symbolic continuity that may have served as markers or protective seals. These items could have been intended to safeguard knowledge, acting as keys or guides for future generations who were initiated into the same hidden networks. There are whispered accounts of Roanoke settlers transporting manuscripts, ritual tools, or even fragments of what some believe to be the Holy Grail or other legendary relics. While physical evidence remains sparse and often controversial, the repeated emergence of coded symbols and unexplained artifacts gives credence to the idea that Roanoke was more than a simple colonial experiment. It was a deliberate repository, a hidden stronghold for preserving ancient secrets. The notion of lost codices and manuscripts is particularly intriguing. European archives from the late 16th and early 17th centuries occasionally mention volumes of obscure origin, containing diagrams, astronomical tables, or religious texts that could not be openly studied or circulated. Some researchers suggest that these manuscripts may have originated in the New World, brought back to Europe by returnees from a colony. If true, they would represent a direct connection between Roanoke and the esoteric knowledge of medieval Europe, a tangible link between a vanished settlement and the secretive societies that sought to preserve wisdom across centuries. Even more tantalizing are reports of codices that seem to vanish almost as soon as they are discovered, either confiscated, hidden, or deliberately removed from circulation. Such occurrences reinforce the notion that certain forces were actively involved in guarding or controlling access to this knowledge, elevating the mystery of Roanoke from a historical curiosity to a deliberate act of secrecy. Physical artifacts, too, have played a critical role in sustaining these theories. Objects such as carved wooden pieces, metal implements of unusual craftsmanship, and even ceremonial-looking tools suggest the presence of advanced knowledge or ritual practices not commonly associated with ordinary settlers. Some items seem intentionally marked with symbols that align with Templar traditions or other esoteric systems, hinting that these objects were part of a coded framework meant to be understood only by those initiated into the hidden network. The careful placement of such artifacts within the settlement or in surrounding areas may have served as a deliberate strategy, both to protect them and to communicate directions or information to those who could interpret the code. In this sense, Roanoke was not simply a colony. It was a repository, a living vault whose guardianship extended beyond the ordinary demands of survival into the realm of secret knowledge. Another aspect that adds depth to this theory is the possibility that the treasures and objects were not solely material in nature. Some historians argue that the true value of Roanoke's hidden legacy lies in its encoded knowledge, the understanding of navigation, astronomy, sacred geometry, and symbolic communication passed down from the Templars or other secretive European orders. These forms of knowledge may have been considered far more precious than gold or silver, and the colony's sudden disappearance might have been orchestrated to ensure that only those capable of decoding these secrets could access them. The very act of vanishing, leaving only cryptic symbols like crotone, could itself have been part of a protective strategy, hiding the most valuable elements of the colony's legacy in plain sight while diverting attention from the more tangible treasures. Oral traditions from indigenous tribes add another layer of intrigue. Stories passed down through generations speak of groups of foreigners who appeared and then vanished, leaving behind objects or knowledge that was carefully guarded. While these accounts are often dismissed by mainstream historians as folklore, they gain new significance when considered alongside the esoteric and symbolic clues from Roanoke itself. Could it be that local tribes became inadvertent custodians of sacred objects or knowledge, helping to shield them until the right heirs or initiated seekers emerged? The possibility paints a complex and almost cinematic picture, a colony that is not lost but operating within a network of secrecy, its treasures hidden, its knowledge encoded, and its purpose deliberately concealed from the uninitiated. Finally, the enduring mystery of Roanoke's treasures and sacred objects speaks to a larger narrative of human curiosity and the desire to preserve what is considered invaluable. Whether these items were relics of religious significance, manuscripts containing esoteric wisdom, or coded tools guiding future seekers, the fact that we are still searching, still uncovering fragments and clues centuries later, highlights the depth of the colony's secretive mission. Roanoke becomes more than a historical puzzle. It transforms into a cinematic tale of guardianship, secrecy, and deliberate preservation, a story in which every artifact, every cryptic symbol, and every fragmentary record may hold a piece of a legacy designed to transcend time, geography, and even the understanding of ordinary history. The treasures may be hidden, their significance encoded, but their presence lingers, whispering to those patient and curious enough to listen, urging us to look beyond the obvious and consider what secrets have been buried, not just in the soil of North Carolina, but in the hidden currents of history itself. As the mystery of Roanoke deepens, conventional explanations begin to falter. Historians have long suggested famine, disease, or conflict with local tribes as the primary reasons for the colony's disappearance. Yet the evidence supporting these claims is remarkably thin. There is little sign of violent struggle, and skeletal remains are conspicuously absent, leaving a void where one would expect evidence of catastrophe. The absence of bodies, combined with the suddenness of the colony's vanishing, challenges any purely natural explanation. It is here that more extraordinary theories begin to emerge, ideas that push the boundaries of accepted history and venture into the realm of the unexplained. Could the settlers have been guided by forces or knowledge that modern observers cannot fully comprehend? Was Roanoke's disappearance the result of deliberate concealment, orchestrated by powerful networks with agendas hidden from the public eye? Or might there have been influences that border on the supernatural, invisible hands shaping the fate of men and women thousands of miles from Europe? One such theory suggests that the Roanoke settlers may have been involved in experiments or activities connected to esoteric knowledge or sacred traditions, perhaps those inherited from the Knights Templar. If the colony was indeed a repository of sacred objects or coded wisdom, as some researchers speculate, then its disappearance could have been a controlled evacuation to safeguard this knowledge. The cryptic word croton, carved into a tree, may have been a deliberate signal, a coded instruction rather than a simple place name, pointing to a safe refuge or secret hiding place. From this perspective, what looks like a vanishing is transformed into a carefully orchestrated operation, a deliberate act to protect treasures and information from prying eyes or authorities who might have exploited or destroyed them. The more one examines the sparse evidence, the more the notion of a natural disaster seems inadequate, replaced by a scenario of intentional concealment layered with symbolism and secrecy. Another set of theories ventures even further into the unknown. Some researchers propose that the colony may have encountered phenomena that modern science struggles to explain, time anomalies, dimensional shifts, or other forces that defy conventional understanding. While these ideas may seem fantastical, they have been inspired by the inexplicable nature of the settlement's disappearance. Entire villages vanish in legends and myths across cultures, often leaving cryptic symbols or artifacts behind. Roanoke fits this archetype uncannily well. A group of settlers disappears without trace, leaving behind tantalizing markers that suggest they were somewhere else, yet not entirely gone. Could there have been interactions with unknown energies or natural anomalies that caused the colony to seemingly dissolve from the landscape? These ideas remain speculative, yet they offer a lens through which to view the historical record, not as a failure or tragedy, but as a mystery carefully engineered to protect something of profound importance. The possibility of collusion with indigenous tribes adds another layer of intrigue. While traditional theories often posit conflict between settlers and Native Americans, there is also evidence to suggest cooperation and shared secrecy. Certain tribes have oral histories recounting strangers who arrived, stayed briefly, and then vanished in ways that seemed purposeful rather than forced. These stories, often overlooked in mainstream historical accounts, hint that the colonists may have left intentionally, guided by both knowledge and alliances unknown to European authorities. If these tribes acted as custodians of sacred objects or protected knowledge, the settlers' disappearance becomes not a tragedy, but a carefully executed evacuation, a transition designed to keep the colony's secrets safe. The landscape itself may have been chosen for these protective qualities, with natural barriers, hidden coves, or sacred alignments providing a kind of living vault to shield treasures from discovery. Some theorists also suggest that Roanoke's vanishing was part of a broader pattern of secret societies influencing historical events across continents. If Templar remnants were involved, the disappearance could have been planned to maintain the secrecy of their operations, ensuring that knowledge or relics would remain hidden until the right time or the right initiates could uncover them. Every artifact left behind, every symbol carved into wood or stone, may have been a piece of a larger communication network designed to transmit information across generations. In this framework, the disappearance is not a failure of colonization, but a deliberate act of strategic concealment, executed with precision and purpose. What appears random or tragic is revealed as intentional, a maneuver designed to protect what the Templars, or their successors, valued most. Even centuries later, the implications of these alternative disappearance theories continue to captivate. The idea that Roanoke might have been shielded from history itself, its secrets buried in plain sight, transforms the story from a historical footnote into an epic saga of secrecy, strategy, and human ingenuity. The vanishing becomes a narrative of control over fate, a dramatic statement that some knowledge is too precious to be left vulnerable. The colony's mystery resonates not just because it is unsolved, but because it challenges our understanding of what is possible. Roanoke forces us to consider the intersections of human ambition, esoteric wisdom, and the unknown forces that might influence history in ways we are only beginning to imagine. In doing so, it becomes a story that transcends time, a puzzle that remains alive, whispering across centuries, daring those who listen to think beyond the ordinary and explore the hidden dimensions of our past. Even centuries after the disappearance of the Roanoke colony, modern explorers, historians, and treasure hunters remain captivated by the lingering enigma, driven by the tantalizing possibility that the settlers were guarding something extraordinary. Unlike conventional historical research, which often relies on established documents and archaeological evidence, these contemporary searches blend adventure, intuition, and the pursuit of hidden knowledge. In remote areas of North Carolina and the surrounding regions, private expeditions continue to uncover fragments of pottery, traces of stone foundations, and other artifacts that hint at human presence far beyond what mainstream historians acknowledge. Each discovery is treated with a mixture of excitement and caution, as enthusiasts wonder whether they are merely stumbling upon remnants of a failed settlement, or uncovering pieces of a carefully orchestrated mystery left behind by a group with knowledge far beyond their apparent circumstances. Some of the most ambitious searches have focused on the possibility of hidden caches, secret stashes of artifacts, or even sacred relics that may have been left by the settlers with direct ties to Templar networks. Reports occasionally surface of unusual metallic objects, engraved stones, or carved wooden pieces discovered under layers of soil, often in patterns that suggest intentional placement rather than random disposal. Many of these finds are contested, their provenance uncertain, yet they continue to inspire speculation. Could these objects represent fragments of a larger system of hidden knowledge? Were they left as breadcrumbs for future generations to discover? Or were they protective talismans intended to conceal something far more significant? The very act of searching becomes a form of dialogue with the past, where each artifact recovered carries the possibility of revealing secrets carefully hidden for centuries. Beyond the physical artifacts, researchers have also turned to the written record, scouring archives, private collections, and rare manuscripts in search of overlooked clues. Letters, diaries, and merchant records occasionally hint at connections between European elites and transatlantic colonies, including mentions of people or objects unaccounted for in conventional histories. Some of these documents suggest that information about the fate of Roanoke may have been deliberately suppressed, either to protect the secret of its treasures or to maintain the public narrative of a failed colony. This possibility has led modern explorers to view historical documents not merely as records of fact, but as maps of hidden knowledge, encoded with references that require interpretation, patience, and sometimes a willingness to accept patterns that defy conventional logic. Technology has played an increasingly significant role in these modern investigations. Ground-penetrating radar, drone surveys, and advanced GIS mapping techniques allow researchers to detect foundations, pathways, and anomalies beneath the surface that would have been invisible to earlier generations of archaeologists. In some cases, these technological breakthroughs have led to the discovery of complex settlement patterns and subtle alignments that echo esoteric knowledge or sacred geometry, further fueling speculation about the colony's secret purpose. Even the absence of findings can be significant. The locations where no traces are found may themselves have been deliberately cleared or concealed, creating a landscape engineered to protect secrets rather than reveal them. In this way, the modern search becomes almost a puzzle in reverse, where what is missing is as important as what is discovered. Controversy naturally follows these modern hunts. Academic historians often dismiss many of the claims as speculation or romanticized adventure, emphasizing the lack of verifiable evidence and the tendency for enthusiasts to read too much into coincidences. Yet, the persistence of anomalies, odd artifacts, and strange alignments challenges easy dismissal. Some believe that the continued lack of resolution itself is a hallmark of the colony's secretive legacy. If the Templars, or those inspired by their methods, intended to hide something of significance, would they have made it too easy to find? Each new generation of searchers may recover small pieces of the puzzle, yet the larger picture remains obscured, exactly as it may have been intended centuries ago. The tension between modern evidence and ancient secrecy heightens the allure, making each discovery feel like a step closer to understanding a truth that has been deliberately hidden from view. Adding an almost cinematic element to the modern hunt are the stories of unexplained occurrences and coincidences that often accompany these expeditions. Reports of objects moving mysteriously, inexplicable patterns in excavation results, or sudden discoveries in unlikely locations feed the sense that Roanoke continues to communicate across time, leaving breadcrumbs for those attuned to its secrets. While skeptics attribute these phenomena to chance, human error, or overactive imagination, the stories persist, contributing to a narrative in which history itself seems alive, responsive, and perhaps even protective of its most guarded secrets. In the minds of those who seek them, the colony is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a living mystery, inviting exploration, interpretation, and sometimes even a leap of faith. Ultimately, the modern search for Roanoke's secrets is about more than finding artifacts or solving a centuries-old puzzle. It is about engaging with a story that transcends ordinary history, a narrative that blends disappearance, esoteric knowledge, and the enduring allure of the unknown. Every expedition, Every careful analysis of a fragment or manuscript becomes part of a continuum of curiosity that stretches back to the original settlers and beyond, linking past and present in a shared pursuit of understanding. Roanoke, in this sense, remains unfinished, its legacy not confined to what is documented or recovered, but alive in the questions it provokes, the mysteries it preserves, and the promise that some truths, though hidden, still whisper to those willing to listen. As we draw closer to understanding the mystery of Roanoke, all threads begin to converge, revealing a picture that is far more intricate and purposeful than any simple disappearance could explain. When the settlers first arrived on the remote shores of what is now North Carolina, they were not merely pioneers or adventurers seeking land and fortune. Layers of evidence, cryptic carvings, unusual artifacts, coded manuscripts, and whispered European connections suggest that the colony functioned as a carefully orchestrated experiment in secrecy and protection. The question that has haunted historians for centuries, what happened to the settlers, may have a startling answer. They vanished not by accident or misfortune, but as part of a deliberate plan, a carefully executed strategy to safeguard knowledge, artifacts, and possibly even sacred treasures. In this light, Roanoke emerges not as a failure of colonization, but as one of history's most enigmatic acts of preservation. The pieces of the puzzle begin with the obvious yet puzzling markers left behind. The word croton, carved into a tree, and the precise, yet seemingly cryptic, arrangement of tools and remnants within the settlement. On the surface, these appear to be simple, isolated clues. But when viewed through the lens of Templar strategy and esoteric symbolism, they take on profound significance. The colonists were potentially guided by a deeper understanding of cryptography, geometry, and coded communication, a knowledge inherited or inspired by secret European networks, perhaps including remnants of the Knights Templar. These were not ordinary settlers. Their decisions, movements, and seemingly inexplicable vanishing were calculated, designed to protect something that could not be allowed to fall into the hands of curious explorers, colonial authorities, or rival powers. Every artifact left behind, every directional marking, and every structural choice may have been a deliberate signal, a message to those who could interpret it or a decoy to obscure the truth from those who could not. The notion of a transatlantic network further deepens the intrigue. Records suggest that some settlers may have returned to Europe, carrying with them fragments of knowledge, sacred objects, or coded manuscripts. These individuals could have acted as liaisons, connecting the hidden wisdom of the New World with secret societies still active in Europe, ensuring that the knowledge of Roanoke remained protected across continents. From this perspective, the colony's disappearance was not merely physical, it was strategic. It created a dual-layered concealment, leaving the visible settlement empty and the most critical elements, the knowledge, the symbols, and possibly treasures, hidden either within the landscape or transported out of reach, safeguarded for future generations. In this scenario, Roanoke becomes a living vault, its secrecy maintained by both geography and design, its story encoded in the artifacts and subtle signs that survive to this day. Artifacts discovered over the years lend further credence to this theory. Some fragments of pottery, metalwork, and carved wood seem unusually sophisticated for a fledgling colony. Certain designs mirror esoteric European symbols, while others suggest practical knowledge of astronomy, navigation, and geometry far beyond what one might expect of ordinary settlers. Were these merely accidental coincidences, or were they carefully constructed tools, markers, and guides, placed deliberately to convey information to those trained to understand them? In the context of Templar practices, known for their codes, secret rituals, and hidden treasures, the idea that the settlers were acting as custodians of sacred knowledge begins to feel not only plausible, but increasingly compelling. The colony, in this sense, was less a settlement than a living message, a protected repository designed to survive invisibly, communicating only with those initiated into the secret. Layered atop the physical evidence is the mysterious interplay with indigenous tribes, who may have served as both allies and guardians. Oral histories hint at strangers arriving, sharing knowledge, and then disappearing in a manner suggesting deliberate integration rather than forced removal or conflict. If the settlers were safeguarding objects or wisdom of immense value, collaboration with local tribes would have been strategic, ensuring the continued protection of these items. The landscape itself, the dense forests, hidden coves, and remote islands, provided natural defenses, creating a network of hidden refuges that might have housed the colony's most valuable assets. Every choice of location, every interaction with the native population, and every subtle marking could have been part of a carefully executed system designed to protect the secrets of Roanoke from outsiders. The tantalizing possibility of sacred treasures and hidden relics adds yet another dimension to this climax. While no definitive proof exists, accounts of manuscripts, ceremonial objects, and even items rumored to be associated with Templar rituals suggest that the colony's purpose may have extended beyond survival and settlement. These items could have included manuscripts encoded with knowledge of astronomy, navigation, and geometry, sacred relics of historical or spiritual significance, or even objects associated with legendary quests such as the Holy Grail. The deliberate disappearance of the colony, then, becomes not a tragedy, but a protective measure, ensuring that these treasures remain beyond the reach of those who might misuse or exploit them. Every cryptic word, every carved symbol, every artifact left behind becomes part of a larger design, a map not of land, but of knowledge, meant to be decoded by those attuned to its significance. Even centuries later, the implications of this orchestrated vanishing continue to resonate. Roanoke's story challenges our understanding of history, revealing the possibility that deliberate secrecy, coded knowledge, and hidden networks have shaped events far more profoundly than is commonly acknowledged. The colony was not a simple failed settlement, but a carefully engineered enigma, one designed to endure in fragments, whispers, and coded messages, awaiting those capable of perceiving the patterns. By examining the cumulative evidence, the artifacts, the maps, the European connections, and the mysterious interactions with indigenous tribes, we begin to glimpse a deliberate strategy of concealment, one that transforms Roanoke from a historical curiosity into a narrative of intelligence, foresight, and profound secrecy. In the final analysis, Roanoke serves as a testament to the enduring power of hidden knowledge and the lengths to which humans will go to preserve it. Whether the settlers were Templar initiates, allies of secret networks, or custodians of sacred wisdom, their disappearance was part of a broader design that continues to captivate our imagination. The colony's legacy is not confined to the fragments of pottery or wood that survive in museums or private collections. It lives in the enduring sense of wonder, the sense that history is never entirely what it seems. Roanoke whispers across centuries, urging us to consider the possibility that some truths are deliberately hidden, that some knowledge is guarded with extraordinary care, and that the past may hold secrets we are only beginning to comprehend. The colony's vanishing, enigmatic and deliberate, becomes both a warning and an invitation, a call to look deeper, think more critically, and recognize that in the quiet forests and hidden clearings of history, secrets may endure long after the people who created them have vanished.